Hi everybody, my name is Tian Hui Ng. I am the music director of New England Philharmonic, and here together with me is Eric Nathan, our composer in residence. Eric, would you say a few words and tell us about your first interactions? How did you first come to know about New England Philharmonic, and how did that tell us the story of how you became our probably longest serving composer in residence ever?
Well, almost. David Rakowski, I think, beat me by 1 year.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
We should have just extended it by 2 years.
Yeah. Shucks. Yeah. I first heard of the New England Philharmonic from Dick Pittman, who was the previous music director, now music director emeritus, and he invited me to become composer in residence. I think it was actually through my teacher, Stephen Stuckey. He asked him for some recommendations, and Stuckey said, "Oh, Eric's just moved to the area to teach at Brown. You should check out his music." So I started that first year, and halfway through the year, there was also the 2020, the pandemic began, and then Dick had his stroke, and so everything kind of stopped in the middle of that first year. So I'd been to a few performances of the orchestra. They had actually played a piece of mine the year before I was composer in residence. But then everything stopped, and then it actually became quite a different role at that point, because the board was without artistic leadership, and so I kind of filled in that void to help program the season during the pandemic years, and then help the board as we did a search for music director, which yielded your appointment.
I see. And you know, it's always so interesting to go back in history and think of those moments, right? Those times. Like, you know, tell us about the piece that the orchestra played before you became composer in residence, and what were like some of your first impressions?
Sure. Yeah, that piece is called Pestum, and it's inspired by actually the site of Greek ruins in Italy, near Salerno. And so that piece is very active, and there's a lot of rushing sounds and very kind of big climactic moments. And yeah, I was immediately impressed by the orchestra, and just also coming to the performance and seeing the concert program is just filled with contemporary pieces, and then also pairing with some older works from the 20th century repertoire, but there was really no Beethoven or Brahms or Mozart to be found anywhere, and the orchestra just loved it. And so this was really an eye-opening experience to see, look, we can feature programs of living composers of 20th century music, and it can be something that the orchestra can really embrace, and the audience
it's interesting, you know,
the older music.
Basically what you're saying in between the lines also is that the stuff that this orchestra considers the old standard canonic pieces is probably often where the orchestras would consider the contemporary ends.
Yes.
You know, so it's like, we're referencing stuff in the 20th century, and we're playing a lot of stuff from this century, and also of your work. And you know, this has been really quite the year with you as well, with the premiere of this, you know, brand new flute concerto with Alejandro Escuer. Could you tell us a little bit about, like, you know, your inspiration, but also, like, you know, the process of working with Alejandro, you know, since he was, you know, in this amazing situation of being also, I believe, performer in residence at Brown, where you teach.
Oh yeah. So Alejandro came to my course at Brown in the fall of I guess last fall, and so he was an artist in residence. Students wrote pieces for him for flute and electronics, and he premiered those pieces. That was our first time really working together, and out of that grew an invitation to write a concerto for him. And so, yeah, that piece, which we premiered this past fall, was called The Seas Between Us, and it's inspired by the sea and both its destructive power, but also its life-giving power, and also the ways it can divide people geographically, but also ways that it can serve as the link between cultures. You can bridge the gap by sailing across the sea and finding each other. And so this piece, yeah, I was writing it, and as I was writing, I was sending bits of it to Alejandro, and he would write back and say, "Oh, this isn't possible. This would feel better. How could you think about doing this?" And so up until the premiere, we had some edits, but we just gave the next performance is in Mexico recently, and the piece is still evolved. So
I was going to say that did it change some more?
yes, so Alejandro has had a lot of creative ideas about things he'd like to add. So he's like, oh, I really want to sing out even more here. So he's actually improvised and added some new lines, which I approved, which haven't been written down yet, but he was kind of improvising them in the orchestra setting and adding some trills on some notes. And so I felt it kind of like what it must have felt to work with Joachim with Brahms, where you give it to a soloist and the soloist puts some of themselves in it, and the piece actually starts to be both a piece that's written by me, but also written by Alejandro in a sense.
It's such a fascinating collaboration, right? Composer and performer. I used to remember us talking about this section here, and he was like, he was giving all kinds of suggestions about how to make it speak some more, and the ideas. Did that particular section change because that was also something he was thinking about?
That one didn't change so much. I know there's a tricky fingering for the high G in that, but
right.
but he's just figuring it out. Other bits, like in slower parts, there's some arriving on notes where he's actually added a trill between two fingerings of the same pitch, which gives the sound a watery sound. At the end of the piece, he takes the last note he's playing and then just blows air across the mouthpiece like shh, and it becomes the sound of the C at the end. So he finally joins the orchestra's sounds of the C. So it's actually a really neat conceptual thread that connects to the soloist, which I hadn't conceived of originally.
How cool.
Yeah, very cool.
And also, just as a conductor, and anybody who gets to watch, I think there's probably going to be videos of this coming out if it isn't already posted. There you have very cool instructions for the conductor. Yeah. And I have to say that personally for this piece that we're going to do today, that it's actually kind of difficult to do that because of the amount of things to coordinate. But would you talk a little bit about this? You know what I'm talking about. And would you talk a little bit about the original idea for that, and what you love about that, and in a way for posterity, like what's the performance practice of this?
Yes. So the Tian's talking about this technique where I have the conductor. I've actually notated parts for both of Tian's hands. So there's a part where Tian is conducting in time, and another part where Tian is sweeping the left arm across the orchestra. This comes from a improvisatory jazz practice called sound painting that Walter Thompson invented, and when I was in high school I studied in a jazz ensemble that was using this kind of sound painting technique where conductors would have different hand gestures they would give to the ensemble to help lead improvisation. So when I first was writing a piece for the NEP, a piece that became the piece for the NEP called In Between, which was about trees and forests. So I was trying to convey the sound of, and the experience of hearing all the leaves in a forest rustle and the breeze flows through, and every time it's slightly different, but there's also this panning that happens across the orchestra, and you can kind of turn the orchestra into both like a forest, but also a series of maybe 100 different speakers, like the computer speakers. So you can have like a sonic field where the sound is just traveling spatially on the stage. And so I started with the idea of the sound of trees, but then when I started writing this piece about the sea, I realized, this technique could be used to make the sound of waves. And so you have these waves passing across the ensemble. And so in the Open Again, A Turn of Light, that piece, it also comes back to the idea of waves and the breeze and kind of the thinking of time passing, maybe the sands flowing across the desert or something. So I know in this piece you're having to both coordinate the choir, the orchestra, and do the sweeping, so that it's like rubbing your hand and belly in your head.
It's very fun. I have to say that you probably did think of this, but that gesture and the resultant sound is so tied to all of the historic kung fu films, where like these kung fu, these pugilists, are training their inner chi, and they're like moving one of the leaves of the forests with it.
Oh yes.
And so it's like often a bamboo forest as well. So this is something that you see as as a trope, you know,
Yeah.
in kung fu films that, you know, reference this. There's a little bit of that in you know, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon,
Right.
but that itself is like referencing this whole genre of like
Yeah.
both comic books as well as kung fu,
Yeah.
and it's just really, really interesting to do that. This is because you again, you probably wouldn't notice, but my mom teaches Tai Chi, and so those gestures that you're talking about are actually like really like
Yeah.
actually part of the sequence that
Yeah.
they learn. And as a kid, I used to stand in the sun in the garden of my house, you know, and feel the wind come by and just imagine conducting the wind.
Yeah.
And it was exactly what you're describing. So it just, you know, I think it's just amazing how the world comes around, and I don't think I could have imagined that like 30, 40 years later I would be doing this.
You're actually conducting an orchestra with the winds. too.
With the winds, asked to do so by a composer, so it's been
Yeah.
just be really, really special.
Yeah,
And,
great. Well, I'm glad, and I remember when you were learning the piece, there was an epiphany you had, like, oh, this is like Tai Chi and the wind, and then it all clicked.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. Exactly. It just like kind of clicked with all this stuff from my childhood, which was
Yeah.
really kind of fun. So
Yeah, well, I think this gesture really, it's about the seeing the physicality of it. There's a sonic result. If you just listen to the recording, you hear the sound of waves or breeze going, but by seeing you actually conjure this sound, and there's a result between the gesture and the sonic world, but also there's something magical about it. And I think that part of it is also part of the piece. There's a meditative quality that you might not always get when someone's beating in time, and this is a
Yes.
different type of gesture that you might add in a piece of Brahms when you're trying to get the strings to play very lyrically, like
Yes.
you go side to side, but it has a very one-to-one relationship. You can see the gesture and, oh, that's what the sonic result is.
and it's going to be a great etude for conductors in the future,
Oh,
for
yes.
like, you know, left hand independence, you know, especially the part where you're actually somewhat moving in some kind of rhythm that it's not just a sweep.
Yeah, it gets faster, and you have to keep it going the 3/4 bars, and yeah.
Yes. Very, very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. I wish we had more time to chat as always, but thank you for taking the time to
Yeah.
connect a little bit. I know that even though this is the last concert of this season, that this is certainly not our last engagement with you. I cannot express fully how much the orchestra loves you and loves your music and is so deeply appreciative of all the things you did. You know, you kind of referenced at the beginning of this, you know, with all the work that you did during the pandemic and the search and the artistic direction. And, you know, I still hear talk about, you know, like the way that you rehearsed, you know, and the composer's touch in all of this. And it is deeply appreciated, heartfelt, and, you know, I think it will be remembered for a very long time and treasured. So thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you, Chen, and thank you to the orchestra. It's been a real wonderful privilege and pleasure.
Thank you. See you next.